Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining me in the sixth installment of the Apollo Case Study Series. We usually are joined just by Dr. Jim Moore, but we're also joined by Christina Nylander, another BCBA at the Apollo, or within the Apollo, I guess, array of branches. So, folks, welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. One of the things I want to do, there's a lot of things we want to get to here. And Jim, I think you had a lot of ideas for where to take this discussion. So like we did with Jennifer, I'm going to turn the Q&A over to you. I'll jump in if I have thoughts to offer. There's probably going to be some areas where I can't help but to chime in. But for the most part, I'm going to turn the reins over to you to lead a discussion. So with that having been said, let's go.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Christina, for your willingness and eagerness to be on the podcast. We planned this based on some feedback we've gotten. We've been to a couple of conferences in the last few weeks, and I've been just kind of overwhelmed by the number of folks who have sought us out to thank us for doing the podcast, to talk to us, ask questions. And so I've been soliciting feedback saying, hey, what are some things you'd like to hear? And I'm going to try to incorporate the two biggest pieces of feedback in today's episode. The first one was, hey, we would like to hear from more of your BCBAs, especially those who may not have had any training and experience on the nuances of your clinical model. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about our scientific approach to problem solving. But I think it's behavioral observations tradition to start every guest off by telling us a little bit about yourself, Christina, and tell us how you got into behavior analysis.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited. So my name's Christina. I've been a BCBA for just under 2 years. I'm also a mom. I have a 14-month-old at home. And that's part of the things we're going to be talking about is, how to learn RFT from the ground up, really. And so I'm excited to kind of dive into that from the perspective as a mom, too, because I think that's something that's not really talked about in our fields. And I kind of got into behavior analysis in a wonky but fun story where I had just gotten married to my husband, who was in the military, and we went to our first military Christmas party together. And in my free time, I'm a very social person, and I just happened to meet this girl, and we got to talking. She was asking me, how it was to live near a military base, what my education background was, what I was currently doing for work. And essentially, she was like, hey, with a background in psychology, lots of experience with children, and you hate your desk job, I have the perfect job for you. So I tried out ABA, I became an RBT, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And this February will be 5 years in the field for me.
That is awesome. And now, because of that one kind of serendipitous interaction, now just countless numbers of families are benefiting from your passion and dedication. So I thank you for that. One of the biggest pieces of feedback that I've received, and I want to specifically thank a BCBA from South Carolina named Jennifer, but there are a number of others. In an earlier episode, Matt and I talked about our steps of scientific problem solving, which, as Christina knows, is kind of like at the very base of everything we do. And what I'm hearing from a lot of young BCBAs is, hey, can you talk more about that whole process, especially your parsimonious rule-outs? Because I hear feedback from the young BCBAs, like we talk about here at Apollo, that, wow, we really didn't hear about parsimony, and it seems that every problem I encounter, I go way too far with complexity. So talk a little bit about your own experience when you first, heard the very first time I talked about this, and how has this approach impacted your practice as a BCBA?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think when you're a brand new BCBA, fresh out of school, you're used to doing the research, really diving into these intricate protocols and research articles, creating your own, wanting to really work on that application side of things. But I think when you're in school and when you're a supervisee, you're failed to really learn what I call that BCBA intuition. And what I mean by that is, as a brand new BCBA, I looked at this behavior, watched it for a week, was trying to throw the kitchen sink at it, figure out what's going on here. And I just walked into the clinical director's office and said, hey, I really don't get this behavior. And she was like, yeah, I walked by last week in the hallway for 3 seconds, and I think this is the function. And so you need to do this, just something small. And for me, being able to just look at the environment and not think about it in this complex way and really start trying to do all these extra things and just looking at simple things in the environment, like you say, looking at all the parsimonious rule outs is something that they just really don't talk about, like you said, in school. And so I would say I didn't feel confident in those types of decisions until maybe about 6 to 8 months ago, when you really started hitting heavy on this in our training. And I'll get into it a little bit more, but I think it's really important to talk about because I would spend hours outside of session in meetings, collaborating, researching. So much time went into that when I really wasn't in session. I wasn't on the ground with the RBTs, and I wasn't with them in the trenches as often as I should have been, thinking about it in a parsimonious way. And so when I made this shift, I think the biggest thing for me that came out of it, yes, is having more effective protocols, but also being a more effective leader, because I was able to build that rapport and show my team that I can be trusted because I'm there with them in, the worst times for them. And so that being said, some of the easiest environmental things that we really talk about, number one is, are the adults in that room reinforcing to that child? It's kind of funny to talk about, but we're here to build relationships and show these kids how to build relationships. And what does it portray to them when they don't even like their teacher? If you're walking into that room and they have their back to you, or they don't care that you walked in the room, or you say, hey, it's time to do such and such, and they're giving you that pushback, that's telling you right there that you're not very reinforcing to them. Or my favorite is, I don't care what you give me, I'm still not doing it. So a lot of these kids are thinking, what am I getting out of this situation? And not necessarily thinking about that relationship with you. And so really focusing on that, if you don't have that established rapport with that client, making sure that they really enjoy your presence and they're interested in social interactions with you. Once we address that, then we really look at the environment. Are you controlling those reinforcers? Are they accessing the reinforcer when the maladaptive behaviors are occurring? Are you able to keep that kid safe? If not, obviously that's number one. And then, is the environment messy? I really like to think about it when I explain this to the RBTs. When I go home at the end of the day, if there's stuff all over my floor, if there's laundry that hasn't been done, I cannot relax on the couch and watch TV. I can't unwind. I can't focus, even though that's supposed to be like my, dead brain time. And so if you think about the clients, they can't listen to what you're saying if there's their favorite things on the floor. They're not going to choose to do what you're asking them to do if it's easier for them to just pick up their favorite toy right next to them. So making sure that environment's clean, clutter-free, you're able to control the reinforcers, and then you're able to keep that kiddo safe too. If you're dealing with a dangerous behavior, maybe manipulating the environment so they can't just run out of the room, making that was like your number one thing, actually. Why are the doors open in this clinic? And we were like, wow, we didn't even think about that. It limited all of the noise. It allowed the kids to focus a lot more, but again, kept them safer. And so, once you address your relationship with the client, you address the environment, then we've really been hitting hard too on the learning readiness behaviors. Are they even ready to learn at the table, or do we need to ease them into that? Can they come to the table and that process isn't difficult? Can they then sit down? Can they look at the speaker? And then can they not touch the stimuli until the instruction is presented? If not, those are the things that you really need to build up. Otherwise, you're not going to have a successful, learning session at the table whatsoever. And that
let's talk about this one. Sorry, let's talk about that one just a little bit more, because this one can be kind of a hot topic in our field. You hear some that say, well, you really shouldn't even be trying to get them at a table. You should kind of let them lead the session. You should let them do all these other things. And my response to that is what you said earlier is, first, we're very focused on building relationships with our clients, meaningful relationships where they value our attention and they value their time with us rather than time with things. But then the second thing is, we don't want them to be in therapy forever. Mm-hmm. And we have to help them be successful in the environments they're going to move to next. And that's going to be a lot of school environments, a lot of sitting, and a lot of having to wait and kind of delay their access to reinforcers. So talk a little bit, if you can, about, one of the things we really harp on is, you have all these goals, right? And you write a treatment plan that's supposed to last for 6 months. But if the child does not show learning readiness, even if you try to instruct them in a naturalistic setting or on the floor in a play type setting, if they don't have some of those skills that you've talked about, it can be really difficult. How has your practice changed by taking a slower approach? Because one of the things I often say is, you can't spend too much time building good learning readiness.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I have a recent client actually that once we went through all of our training, it, you really shifted the way that I approach this. And, generally we talk a lot about like the first 5 years are the most important, because that's when, you still have that neuroplasticity. That's when kids are able to, learn a lot faster and they make more progress. So generally, when we have clients that are closer to 5 or above 5, it can be more difficult. They're a lot, a lot more set in their ways, and they just don't want to do, if they've never been introduced to that type of environment, it's very difficult for them. And so I really worked on that for the first few months of therapy, and it felt like I wasn't doing anything. I felt really unproductive, but then I could see that this client wasn't just they were an active participant in their learning environment. I think, when a lot of people think of DTT, they think of just this person sitting there and they're waiting on the instruction. They're like, okay, I'm going to touch this. Okay, I'm going to do this. Okay, now give me what I asked for and I'm going to leave. But when you take the time to really build this up, to see this client's body language now, as opposed to, when I just used traditional ABA and I didn't focus on these things before, he is sitting up, he's excited, he's looking at us, he's smiling the whole time. He gets like so pumped when he actually answers something right. Like he almost praises himself, and he really solicits feedback from us too. Like he's like, look at me, did I do good? He wants to make sure he makes that eye contact with us and smiles. And again, when you build these things, you build this repertoire where this child is excited to learn, and they're that active participant in that environment, and they're not just there because you told them to, essentially.
That's exactly right. I've seen that even with my own son. He's completing his 6th week of therapy, and for 6 weeks they've really worked on building the relationship with him, conditioning adult attention as a reinforcer, and this really kind of gradually, almost using, we do use Alice Schillingsburg's protocol for building rapport and demand fading. And so just yesterday, 6 weeks into therapy, was his first foray into discrete Charles training at the table. Now, if you'd have told me 6 weeks ago that my 3-year-old son would be sitting there clapping and cheering for himself and high-fiving his therapists, I would have, even given my approach, I would have said, no. But I really appreciate that everyone on our team we've kind of slowed down, and we're really trying to, how do we build someone who loves to learn, who loves to interact with the people in their environment, and ultimately, because I think there is a narrative in our field right now that, oh my gosh, demands, working at the table, these are bad things. And it's just not true. If you've not taken the time to really help the child begin to value those things and enjoy those things, then yeah, it's probably going to be a rough time. You're going to probably have a child who's very motivated to get away from the table, who will cry, who will scream. And the truth is if you take that time, we're just seeing it case after case after case, that it just doesn't have to be that way. And then when they're getting closer to school age, it's like, wow, that's usually the big hurdle you hear. Matt is in the schools all the time. It's like they won't sit, they won't accept instruction, they're all over the classroom. Well, we've already dealt with that. We've made it a context where they are almost become self-motivated because we've built such a positive and rich history with that. Well, that was kind of the first part of our training, right? And you were here for that. Everyone, when I came in, I think they're like, oh, they've hired this RFT guy to be our chief clinical officer. And then here it comes. And we're several months into my tenure and we haven't even talked about RFT. And then for you personally, and I think this is important for a lot of our parents who are BCBAs out there, once we initiated the RFT training, something very specific happened in your life that kind of interrupted that training. Talk a little bit about that and your experiences and how you kind of dealt with that. Because I know one of the things you said to me after you came back was, I feel so behind now. And now here you are, really barely 2 years into your professional career, already acting much more senior than the 2 year, two people with 2 years of experience that I'm accustomed to seeing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I had a baby. I had a baby. I'm just laughing, actually, thinking about one of your first days, and I was, 7 months pregnant, and I was trying to stop a kid from eloping outdoors, and it's like, oh man, Dr. Moore's first day, he's watching me keep this kid safe with this big old belly. It was a time. But yeah, sorry, it's off topic. But I had a baby. So like you said, you really had this buildup. We really worked on that instructional control. And then I was so invested in my learning. I am a lifelong learner. That is one of, the things that I value most is growing and constant growth. And it's one of the reasons I'm in this field. But I went into labor and then my learning kind of stopped in ABA and it kept going for all of my colleagues. And I think as someone, anyone in this field, I feel like we really struggle to keep our BCBA identity out of our personal life almost. Like it's meshing. Like you're always thinking ABA once you get in this field. Like you can't ever unthink it and ever unsee it. But yeah, so I had my baby. I came back, and for those that haven't had children, just to kind of describe it a little bit, and everyone's experience is different, but there's a lot of hormones and emotions involved. You just birthed this human being and you're exhausted, you're not sleeping, but also you don't ever want to leave this little bundle of joy. And so it's really hard coming back to work. And then I also had to come back, and not only did I feel behind on training, but the person that was, able to take over my case and fill in for me while I was gone, she got injured the day after I came back. And so I immediately had to jump back in, and I did not understand RFT. I did not understand peak. I did not understand our new ITP format. I didn't understand anything that was going on, but I just kind of had to dive in while also redefining my work-life balance, because now I did have two different identities that I wanted to really keep separate. And that was being a mom, and my time as a mom would not involve my work. And then being a BCBA, and yes, I'm still a mom, but also making sure that I'm still as dedicated as I was to my work, as I was before I had my baby. So that, and then also I'm a nursing mom. And so I had to manage all of our meetings, our trainings, our admin tasks, supervisions, while also figuring out how to pump to make sure that I could still nourish my baby. So much going on, so much I had to figure out and catch up on. And it felt like Mount Everest. It felt like I wasn't going to catch up. And so it was really hard for me. And I had to really think about why I was in this field still. And I had to really think about how I was going to move forward from that, because it felt like this lull in this rut that I wasn't quite sure how to get out of. And I hadn't really encountered that, because I'd only been a BCBA for a year-ish, not even a year, before I went on maternity leave. So I had to really, sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I kind of want to talk a little bit about that, because I think now, over a year removed from that, I think, did you feel that when you came back that you see all your colleagues and you can see that their skills in this area have progressed, even on your own team with your own clients? You're like, wow, I don't understand this programming. I think now you understand, because you very often feel very comfortable coming to me, going to your clinical director, now collaborating and even helping train some of our youngers. Do you feel like at that point in your career, I think there's this idea, I don't think imposter syndrome is the right word, but it's almost like, okay, if I don't figure this out on my own, it makes me look like I'm weak or incompetent or whatever. Did you struggle with some of those feelings or some of those thoughts?
Absolutely. I think, as BCBAs too, I think it's just inherent in us that we want to be perfectionists a lot of the time. And it's really hard for us not to grasp concepts, especially when you become a BCBA and you're supposed to know things when your RBT asks you. And a lot of people aren't comfortable saying, I don't know, actually, give me a second, let me figure it out. And that's something I had to get really comfortable with, particularly when I came back from maternity leave. And so, that was one of the things that I had to really work on in myself. And like, it is okay not to know the answer. It is okay to come to terms with the fact that I am behind. And that's not a bad thing. Like, I think I had to really change my thought process behind it. And that's how I really navigated how to get out of it. I don't understand this DT, a direct training target. I don't understand why it's implemented. So I can't really coach my team if I don't know why this is being implemented. So figuring out either who programmed it or someone that uses it very often. And I haven't told the team this, but I actually stalked their learning trees on Central Reach quite a bit. And I'm like, okay, I don't understand this. This is the person that I see that uses it the most often with their clients. I'm going to go make a meeting with them, or I'm going to go reach out to them and make sure that someone who's very fluent in that can catch me up, just so that way it's easier on everyone. And, we're not asking multiple people. And so really focusing on one thing at a time. And I think that really translates to anyone in the field, whether you're an RBT or you're just starting an ABA, whatever it is. ABA is something that you just have to jump into. You got to jump in the deep end and you have to learn as you go. And you have to be okay with making those mistakes and learning through them. You can't be perfect. You can't know everything initially. So
there's a lot there. So I want to unpack that just a little bit, because I think you said a lot of important things. To give the listeners a little bit of context, during Christina's maternity leave, we had several whole day trainings on kind of the theoretical, conceptual underpinnings of RFT. Why is it important for our clients? 2 whole days of training just on using the peak assessment tools, the peak curriculum, how to program in that. And so Christina missed all of that. And I think that, also our agency grew while she was on maternity leave. And so what I hear, and I want to try and take them one by one, you said something that I've actually told our team so many times are the 3 most important words a behavior analyst should have in their repertoire. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know starts a conversation and starts an exploration to find the answer. It does not show weakness. It does not show incompetence. It shows a confidence that, hey, I don't know the answer, but I feel so confident in my training as a behavioral scientist that I'm going to find the answer. And so I think that's one thing that you said that's really important. The second thing, oftentimes people will joke around, and Matt and I have joked around that before the pandemic, I was kind of hopping all over the country doing trainings, but also consulting with clinics. My wife calls it the Gordon Ramsay kitchen nightmare version of ABA. And, in the clinics that were struggling the most, I always found that collaboration with their peers was almost non-existent. It's like everybody was on their own little island in their own little silos. And then you had this person, maybe they were using the ABLES for their assessment, another person using the VB map, this person's using PEAK, another person's just kind of all over the place using all sorts of things. And so what I hear from you is, and it takes, I think, a lot of confidence and humility to go to a peer and say, hey, you obviously know something I don't right now. Help me understand this. And then at that point, I think you kind of got the confidence because you didn't know me as well then as you do now. And so you came to me, started asking questions, which I think is very important. And then the final thing, I think I really want the listeners to focus on what you said, which is the correct approach to failure. Failure is an important part of the scientific method. It's not one of the steps listed, but very rarely do even the best behavior analysts get it right the very first time. But if you use our science, you use those tools and those methodologies that we have, it's not necessarily a failure. It's the next step to getting the right answer on what's going to work for this particular client. And so I think those were all really, really important things that I hope the listeners, especially those that are young in their career, because I can remember being, 29 years old and I have a PhD and everybody's looking at me like I'm supposed to know everything. And I'm sitting there going, wow. And now here I am 50 years old, been doing this for 26 years. And I still find myself, the more I work in the field, saying, I don't know that. I think there's probably still more to learn about human behavior than I know right now. And I hope that process never stops. And I have, that reminds me, I'm going to ask you a bonus surprise question related to that based on our recent Georgia conference in a minute. But let's first now talk a little bit about, so you've gone through, you did all this work, and just for some more context, one of the suggestions I often make for someone who doesn't have experience with equivalence teaching or RFT programming is, hey, take some of these programs from the DT curriculum, like receptive labeling programs that are audiovisual conditional discriminations, and then keep your tacting programs. Like I'm going to teach them receptively labeling colors, and I'm going to keep tacting colors in baseline to see if it emerges. And you started doing, and so I've told thousands of BCBAs that, but you came up with even more beautiful ways to assess if the child could derive just from that DT curriculum. And I think that's a tribute to you because you kind of leveraged your strengths, because the DT programs in PEAK are very much like most of us have done most of our careers. Yeah. And then that really gave you a springboard. And I want you to talk specifically about specific cases that you're proud of where you've integrated kind of all the facets of our model, direct training, equivalence, RFT, and kind of tell us a little bit about those and what's going on with those kids now.
Yeah. I think, if it particularly pertaining to our talk at GABA, two of the clients that we presented were my clients, and they both made such great success. And while I have lots of clients to talk about with, their successes and their progresses they made and how proud I am of my team and how they were able to teach, all of our clients here. But I think I really would love to hone in on those same two, and we can talk about others as well. But when you're establishing the instructional control, those learning readiness behaviors, and you start teaching the direct training module, which, like you said, is a lot of overlap with, or has a lot of overlap with the VB map. And it's still very natural to program. Once you start getting into the equivalence module and the transformation module, and you start introducing non-arbitrary relations, you see a lot of the rigidities that our clients have, or restrictive repetitive routines and behaviors that they fall into and that they really desire, they start to come out because they've never been challenged in a way that's not very black and white. I think in ABA, a lot of times we still teach very black and white concepts, but life is very gray. And so that's why we see, well, they look really great now, but for some reason, when we're trying to maybe fade into a group, a group session, it's not really working. And it's because they haven't had to work on, allowing an adult to not attend to them 100% of the time. And sorry, go ahead.
And they go into those community settings where maybe teachers or other adults are not going to be as forgiving on some of the rigid rules they want to have adults follow. And so you see this like, oh, it's great. They're doing great. Look at all these targets that they've mastered. But it really doesn't matter if they go out in the community and they fail.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so when you start diving into those things, like I said, I have two clients that I love to talk about, and they both had really great successes, made really great progress. But one of them had a lot more skills in the verbal comprehension, and another client still was performing above age level. But when we talk about the jump between 4 and 5, which we talk about a lot here at Apollo, because we do a lot of that early intervention side, the first 5 years, there's a huge jump in the verbal comprehension skills from the ages of 4 to 5. So while it might look like your client is performing above age level, they may not be at that trajectory to still meet that 5-year-old, target and where kids are at when they turn 5. And so it's really important when you're learning equivalence, when you're learning RFT, when you're learning peak, when you're learning these things, to look at the future. And that's not only in your programming and in the age norms, it's where is this client going? You might have, say, a 10-year-old and they're going to go into middle school soon. Okay, well, you need to start really teaching peer pressure. You need to start teaching about puberty. You need to start teaching about these things that are in their near future. And I think sometimes as behavior analysts, we're so focused on what's going on right now. What are the behaviors we see right now? And yes, those are very important, but you still need to plan for their future because they're still going to become teenagers and adults one day. And what is that going to look like? And how can we help them prepare for that now?
And that's right. And as they get older, their world is going to become naturally more arbitrary. Mm-hmm. Puberty, it's a physiological phenomenon, but there's so much arbitrariness just trying to make sense about what's going on with you. And if you don't have that repertoire, I can't imagine how difficult that is. And now I hear behavior analysts present and talk all the time about, hey, we're trying to teach about gender identity. We're trying to teach about other concepts that might be important to the family, and they're all arbitrary. And the child does not have a repertoire where they can even discriminate arbitrary stimulus relations. Mm-hmm. And then we wonder why they're failing. And I think it's because so many behavior analysts just aren't taught to look at, and I love how you put it as black and white, and where life is really gray. It's like the life of a typically developing adult is a life of swimming through arbitrary, dynamically changing environmental contexts, mm-hmm. And are we equipping our kids to the best extent they can to navigate those types of contingencies?
Yeah.
So, and in particular, I know one of the kids you're thinking about, and he had made such progress. I can remember, Christina, the first day, I don't actually remember you dealing with a kid eloping, but I do remember you dealing with a kid who was laying on his back, pounding the windows with his feet. And that's all he would do all day long. Had very little vocal speech, pounding his feet. And I think that when you see how much progress he made, naturally, you just want to say, okay, now you're ready. But now we've learned, okay, all the signs, is that trajectory? Because, our friends in developmental psychology would say, hey, what are you doing to cover that language explosion that's going to happen? What are we going to do to deal with arbitrariness, especially how they go out in the social environment? And I remember this particular client saw Kristen Vaughn, our vice president of clinical operations, at an Autism Speaks event outside of our clinics, and nearly had a meltdown just because he was like, you're not supposed to be here. In his world of rigid, non-arbitrary rules, Kristen's only supposed to be at Apollo. Kristen's not supposed to be out here where I am with my family. Mm-hmm. And those are all signs that, while I think in a lot of clinics that, I mean, earlier in my career, I probably would have discharged him. But now we see, okay, here are a very precise set of skills we need to focus on with him versus your other client, same age, I think actually a little younger, but we were seeing that trajectory. He was going to blow past his typically developing peers at 5. He was handling arbitrary concepts. He was getting into arbitrary stimulus relations in the transformation module. So even though he's younger, and you could argue that their differences in outcomes may be, quantitatively, not that significant, it really was when you looked at where are their skills falling right now.
And since kind of this whole conversation is really geared toward newer BCBAs and, people early on in their career, I really want to touch on the fact too that when you're first establishing your caseload, and you're no longer an RBT and you're no longer in session, seeing the progress moment by moment and getting that immediate reinforcement, I want to remind all the new BCBAs, and maybe you didn't experience this, but I definitely did. I didn't get as much reinforcement out of my career initially because I would see, yes, this client is making such great progress, but look at this client over here. And it diminished my excitement for my other cases. And it almost drained me. And I never really contacted reinforcement as a new BCBA. And so I got actually really burnt out. And I was like, you know what? I made a mistake. I should have just stayed in RBT. What am I doing? And I had to really stop myself from always focusing on the fires I needed to put out. And that's part of what the parsimonious kind of strategy is too, is if you tackle those first, there won't be fires every day for you to put out. And so, for all those really struggling out there, really think about what's the simplest thing that I can work on and change to help this client, but also making sure that you are celebrating your wins, because we do great work every day and there's always wins to look at.
That's so important and so true. And I love the fact, just to come back to parsimony, it can be overwhelming when you try to think, oh, I've got to get this kid and look at my colleagues and all the success that they're having. But what do we know? What do we know about a new client, especially if they're young and have no prior experience in ABA? Parents are doing the best they can. I'm a parent of a child with autism and I'm a BCBAD. And I can tell you, when this sweet boy came into my life, it redefined a lot of the expectations I had as a parent and as a BCBA. And so parents often are just trying the very best they can to make it through their day without significant problem behavior. They don't know things about stimulus control. They don't know how to build stimulus control. No one's taught them that. And so what we get with a new client often is someone who doesn't have much stimulus control. They don't respond to their name because their name's probably said hundreds of times a day with no follow through, not to the fault of the parents. That's just the reality. They don't value adult attention as a reinforcer, except maybe their parents, but anyone else, I remember when my son started, he would clearly tell new people, no, thank you, go away. And now he has to go through the clinic every morning and tell everyone good morning, not because that's a program he mans for that. It's like that. And it's really sweet to see. And when we think about what has been their history of reinforcement, why are we so anxious to get such complicated, contrived contingencies into the life of a small person who's likely had no consistent contingencies in their life? Why don't we just come here and make them love people and love learning? If we do those two things, it's going to be very successful for that young person. So to really kind of, I want to, and here's my bonus question, and stick with me, because and props, Matt's used to me giving shout outs to others in our field when I'm on. And, Vince, you went to Vince Carbone's workshop at GABA this past weekend. And I wasn't able to get away for that. One of our other BCBAs, and Vince has been I've never actually met him personally, but I've admired his work. I've used his work. I've published replications of his methodology. I really, really admire him to a really high extent. And one of our other BCBAs told me that he talked about a topic I have never heard him talk about, which was verbal mediation. And if you recall that part, that sounds a lot like speaker as listener behavior, what he was talking about. And he talked about methodologies to basically train clients how to think privately, or private verbal behavior. Did you walk away from that workshop thinking, wow, he's kind of, but what our other BCBA Mandy told me was he made a clear distinction that this was not RFT, but I don't care what you call it. It's really just another word for the same thing. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, it is a word for the same thing. And it was funny. I don't know, and you guys can edit this out, but it's funny to me that people are so passionate about the simplest things in our field. Like, why can't we just call it RFT? Like, I don't know, why do we have to call it 3 different things? It's always bothered me. But yeah, no, I mean, he really talked about basically, like you said, what he described, I don't know if she explained it to you, but he basically used prompt fading to have kids repeat the multiple instructions. And then as he faded out the prompts, the kids then just automatically repeated the multiple instructions and then like talked it through as they did it to make sure they were remembering the order it was given. And so that is essentially what we do every day here with relational frame theory. I thought the way that he went about teaching it was very thought out and thorough. And I think no matter what you call it, the more people that hear about that and learn about it will begin to really think about, when we are teaching, we do need to teach clients to think about what we ask them, mentally process it, so that way they can remember and recall. Because I think that's one of the things that really gets forgotten about in our field, because people just don't know how to teach it. And it's recalling information and, memorizing and remembering things. And that's literally, I mean, I have to do that 100% of the day, all of the time. I have to remember Matt's name. I have to pick up milk before I go home. Like, you're not going to be able to function without that skill in your repertoire. And so why are we forgetting to teach that? Maybe just because we don't want to call it something. I don't know.
Well, I think what's happening, and I think Matt might have a question or comment, but here's my observation. And I often chuckle because people now are labeling me like an RFT zealot or whatever it is. And it's not really that at all. I'm just going to go with the methodologies I think will produce the best lives for our clients. There are many in the RFT world who don't care about that private behavior. They don't really want to talk about it. They said, hey, if you just do this, it's going to work. And it's shockingly kind of a methodological behaviorist approach. I want to know the mechanisms, and I think Vince wants to know the mechanisms that drive that, because for some of our kids, just our traditional prompts and error correction will not produce that private behavior. And we all do it. If you go to the grocery store, you're like, oh, wait, gosh, I forgot my list. My wife's not responding to my texts. I have to think. I might have to visualize what's in the cabinet. Okay, she's cooking her meatloaf tonight. She needs ketchup. In the refrigerator that's next to the mayonnaise. Okay, we're out of ketchup. And most people can usually get home with at least 80% of what they were supposed to have. Why do behavior analysts shy away from talking about those? I think they're behaviors. Skinner said everything was either a behavior or part of the environment, and the skin was not a limiting factor that divided you from a physical realm into a psychic realm. He said, my toothache is the same as my typewriter. Everything's on the physical realm. And so I love to hear that he's real, because the one thing you can always count on from Dr. Carbone is precision. It's going to be precise and it's going to work. And I really love to hear that. And I'm actually, if Dr. Carbone happens to listen, if he wants to reach out, we'd love to have him come and do some trainings for us. But anyway, Matt, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I got to jump in here. So I had the opportunity to go to the Verbal Behavior Conference last spring in Austin, Texas, and there was so much content on speaker as listener and covert rehearsal, and everything that you guys are just talking about. So it seems like there's this universal phenomenon that are occurring in language and memory and cognition. And then, perhaps people are using different principles to kind of describe what's going on, but the phenomenon are what they are, it seems like. And there's, so Vince did a presentation, if I recall correctly, talking about this. And then I believe Kevin Luzinski has done a lot of work in this area. David Palmer, Sarah Lashago. I'm probably forgetting some of the other people at the event who spoke to this very topic directly. So if folks, I'm just kind of going to put in an informal plug for looking at that. I'm not sure if you can purchase those retroactively. They're on Behavior Live though, and they have their new slate of speakers for the upcoming conference in March is available. So I'm just going to put that in the show notes. Again, I just kind of put that out there because I think they do talk a lot about these things. Certainly not from the perspective, not using the terms RFT, but again, it seems like there's these universal phenomenon about how humans make meaning and function in the universe, if you will. And it would be a mistake to close off to that just because the title of the conference is the Verbal Behavior Conference, and you're a quote
exactly
quote unquote an RFT person. I'm using air quotes here that the listener.
Yeah, I had somebody at GABA say, since you're not a verbal behavior person anymore, I said, what are you talking about?
Stop right there. Yeah.
Whoa. And, I think that, maybe this could be like a call to our field to say, hey, there's too many, not just kids, there's too many people who benefit from the outcomes that we're talking about for us to continuously argue over what you call it. Mm-hmm. For me, it's, I don't believe relational frames are things or magical things. I believe it highlights sources of contextual stimulus control. And when I know that, I can use those same procedures that all those people that you just listed are using to help my client navigate those. One of the games I used to play with my older children was always today's opposite day, and a lot of our clients, if we went into their room and if they're nailing money relations, and I say, but today is opposite day. So now which is more, $10 or $5? And they can't do that because it's like, no, it's not. What are you doing? What are you talking about? And the fact is that somebody might not just come out and say, hey, today's opposite day, but to survive in our world, like Christina, in her interactions with me, she knows my baseline behavior, but she also has to recognize, okay, looks like Dr. Moore's not having his best day ever right now based on what I'm seeing here. What can I do in response to that? Or maybe the best thing to do is, interact with him tomorrow or all these other things, where now the rules of how I normally behave for whatever reason, unbeknownst to my staff, are just different. That happens in every workplace, and are we equipping our kids to be successful? Because despite what some of my colleagues would say, I think one of the areas where we need to improve the most is in the teaching of social behavior. And I'm sorry, a direct contingency analysis only or approach only just won't do that. But anyway, I digress. Maybe we can have.
I know you're getting passionate
to bring us all
hear
together.
The table tapping.
Oh my gosh!
I'm just joking. It's a little inside joke, and folks.
Again, I'm a drummer. That's what I was doing in a previous life before I became a behavior analyst. So I tap on everything, and it's a distinct signal to my wife that my anxiety level or my passion is getting a little elevated. I try to be a pretty even keel person most of the time, but anyway. But let's shift now to another topic, which is another kind of sticky area. Like, I'm not a peak person. I use peak because I think it's a really effective assessment and curriculum for a lot of our kids. And so, but I want to put that caveat out there that I do think Mark Dixon has caught some lightning in the bottle, especially with the second half of that curriculum. But of course, we use that quite a bit, and we have to tailor it quite a bit to the individual needs of our clients. But what tips or suggestions would you give? Because I hear a lot of BCBAs like, hey, I went to your level 1 before the pandemic and I was so excited. And now I've gotten the books and here I am all by myself and I'm lost and I'm just going to give up. So what suggestions would you give to BCBAs who are maybe thinking about starting with Peak or who have really kind of started and now they're like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? I'm so lost.
Yeah. Definitely me when I got back from maternity leave. I was actually joking with some of the other BCBAs. I was kind of like going through what I wanted to say and how I wanted to answer questions. And I was like, yeah, when I got back from maternity leave and felt very left behind, I was like, can I actually be homeless? Can I just go live in the forest and we'll be raised by bears? I don't know. But it was scary because I just didn't understand, didn't know where to go with it. And so I think my 3 things that I really hit hard on, and I think not necessarily I hit hard on, but things that are also really helpful that we have as tools here at Apollo, is one of them is a visual for the programs. I think, Dr. Moore, you've said this, so I'm just repeating you. I don't actually know, but you said there's like 168 programs in every book, the DT, G, E, and T within Peak. And so when you think about that number of programs, it's going to be impossible to keep track of where you're at under each book or which domain that you should be targeting for which level within T. And, are you in non-arbitrary? Are you in cultural with oppositional targets? But maybe in a different domain, you're in a different level. And so without a visual tracker for that, we have like an Excel document that kind of shows everything to us and we can track it there. But if you don't have that, it's extremely difficult to organize your thought processes, organize your programs, and make those decisions on where you should go from there.
And just as a matter of context too, we're not talking about the triangles. We're talking about basically in almost like a factor grid, all the modules laid out so you can see everything in one Excel screen.
Yeah. So kind of like I mentioned with the T module, just for an example, the T module has non-arbitrary, cultural, arbitrary, and then advanced arbitrary. So there's like those 4 categories under the T module itself, but the triangle does not distinguish any of that. And so when you're programming, if you just have the triangle, you don't actually know which level you're in, which is actually extremely vital in programming correctly within the T module. So definitely having a visual for that and a way to organize how you're programming that you can use across clients, because it's more of just a tracker for you. And then second is to really hit hard on those foundational learning skills before anything else. And I know this is your biggest thing when you're introducing Peak 2 is if they don't have those foundational learning skills, same with learning readiness. A lot of the learning readiness skills that we talk about are under those foundational learning targets. And so if you're not establishing those first, you are not going to have a productive learning environment ever for that client. So really hitting hard on those first, catching that client up as much as possible in that area. And then making sure too that when you do that, you are making it age appropriate and realistic for that client. You're not going to require every single foundational learning skill for a 3-year-old because they're just not there developmentally yet. So making sure that it's age appropriate, because I see a lot of, BCBAs talking about DDT because you're requiring too much of a small child, but that's something that we should be thinking about and programming for. It's not.
So it's very important. What I'm hearing there is it's vitally important. A lot of BCBAs, especially those who may have come from like biology or computer science, they found ABA, they get their master's degree. It's not uncommon that they've not had a child development or human development course. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's very vital if you're a listener and that applies to you, that's okay. Target some of your continuing education or some of your own self-study and lifelong learning to really, and even for folks like me, the CDC during the pandemic updated a lot of those developmental milestones. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's just continuous learning so that I think that helps us to be even more precise in our programming to say, why are we targeting this? Because a typically developing 3-year-old wouldn't do this.
Yeah, I think, I was lucky enough to work with a daycare setting. But I would say if you have never gone to a daycare setting for the age of clients that you're working with, seek out your nearest daycare and go and see what they're doing there, like the typically developing kids, because I guarantee you that you do not know either what they should or should not be doing at that level. So definitely.
As a quick story to that, well, Jen Friedman was one of her clients who's just made tons of success. About a year ago, he had one of the big exercise balls. He just was flopping on it and flopping on it and flopping on it. And this is after he'd made this huge transformation. And she looks at me and I said, "That's being 3." And she goes, "Okay, thank you." Because she really didn't have a context. It's real easy. I have a video of my 13-year-old when she was 3 years old, engaging in what many behavior analysts would label as vocal stereotypy in the backseat of my car, because she kept singing this phrase over and over and over. But when you hear the context of this is not a child with autism, this is a 3-year-old who the radio in her daddy's car is not working, and daddy's grumpy and not being very interactive, and she doesn't have anything else to do. She's doing what all 3-year-olds do, which is to entertain themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is making sure you have some knowledge of what's developmentally appropriate for a typically developing peer, so that you're not asking too much of your client.
Yeah, definitely. And then the third thing is get really comfy and creative with the way you deliver instructive feedback when you get into the equivalence and, RFT and transformation targets, because you're no longer teaching this matches this. You're teaching the thought process as to why. Why are you answering the way that you are? Which is, again, something that I think we really forget about as behavior analysts, is a lot of our clients are doing things because we told them to, and we're not teaching them how to understand why they're doing what we asked them to do. And so
I think one of the best pieces of feedback I've heard recently is BCBAs on our team in those programs, child makes kind of persistent errors, just saying, "Hey, why do you keep choosing that?" Mm-hmm. And that way we can maybe, and let's get our really hardcore behavior analysts not to freak out with what I'm about to say, because I know all the problems with self-report, but it is a way to possibly take their private behavior and make it public, to where now maybe we can shape it into what we need to help them be successful.
Yeah, I have a good example of that. I have a client who's flying through programs. So I'm struggling to keep up with her. So we directly taught her, finding what's different. And so then I probed kind of that generalization, which is what Peak does pretty frequently. So I was like, forget printing and creating these materials. I'm just going to draw it. So I drew the sample large cat, and then underneath I drew another large cat and a small cat. I said, "Hey, show me different." And she touched the large cat. And I was like, and then I remembered, I was like, let me ask her why. Let me figure out why she answered this way. And I said, "Okay, why did you touch that one?" And she was like, "Well, it doesn't look as happy as your other cat. And the other one looks just as happy as the top cat." And I was like, okay. So you understand the concept. It is different. And then, I asked her, I'm like, okay, well, let's look at the actual picture instead of just the face. Like, then what's different? And then she chose the one that I originally had in mind. So like you said, asking, why did you choose that? Seeing if it's an actual error, if they still understand the underlying concept, and then also pushing it a little further and asking them, okay, well, if we're talking about something different, maybe what am I asking you? And seeing if they can understand that too.
Yeah. And, I think that's a great segue into, we're helping our clients understand the why. What about the importance of us always asking why, making sure our RBTs and our parents always know why? Talk to us about how you've applied this approach of kind of making sure everyone, the why, and everyone else knows the why. How has that affected your work-life balance, and your growth as a BCBA?
Yeah, I think I'll start with RBTs with that one. So my team members, especially green RBTs, I think, they go through the 40-hour training, they go through the competency, and it does not touch on this concept at all. We're really focused on, this is the prompting hierarchy, and this is how you prompt, and it's not, this is how we give that type of feedback. And so a lot of times what I actually do is something that we do at Apollo is we do what we call one-to-one. So we'll meet with our RBTs once a month to kind of go over goals, touch on, subjects that maybe we want them to, learn about, things like that. One of the first things I always do with my new team members in one-to-ones is go through like a real life adult example of something like this. And so I like to sometimes talk about like different languages. And so I'll say something in Spanish, and I'll say, and I'll be like giving them this instruction in Spanish, and they have no idea what I'm asking. And so I'll prompt them through it, and then I'll give them the same instruction, but a different way in Spanish, and then see if they can answer that. Obviously they can. I'm like, that's why, instead of just leading your hand through it, I'm going to explain to you, this word means this. And so if you hear that cue, then you know what I'm talking about. And then once I give that kind of like adult real life example, it helps the new team members understand why they have to talk through thought processes, or why they maybe need to describe what we're teaching more than just focusing on that prompt hierarchy. And okay, now I did partial physical, now I'm going to go down to gestural and things like that.
It kind of reminds me of some of the deriving games that I'll put trainees through. And my favorite one is I'll have them play a little game that's got such a completely arbitrary rule that they have to discriminate to be successful. And then I'll take them through all the prompting and all the things. And then they kind of get the perspective of what it's like to be a client. It's like all of our programs have some sort of rule, which is the rule of how you access reinforcement. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great to really put it on their level and then say, okay, just like for you, this is why we have to do this for our clients.
Yeah. And if you don't kind of walk them through or really take the time to talk to your team members, you don't really get their buy-in either. So sometimes if you go into session and you're delivering that feedback of like, hey, I actually want it run this way, sometimes it's more difficult to run it that way. And so if you don't get that buy-in from the RBT, sometimes people choose to do what's easier when you're not around. Not saying that that's everybody, but that can happen. And then you have that treatment drift. So it's really making sure you have buy-in from everybody in all ends to make sure that we are all on the same page and have that treatment fidelity. And then with parents, obviously I don't get too in depth with them on those types of things. But one recent example that I can give actually is when we're trying to teach the why behind things. A lot of parents, even I do this as a parent. I'm like, no, don't do that. No, don't touch your shoes. No, don't put your fingers in your mouth. And I had a parent and I said, hey, I don't think she understands why she's not allowed to touch her shoes. I was like, why don't you tell her, ew, your shoes are really dirty when she's touching the bottom of her shoes? And mom was like, do you think that's going to work? And I was like, I don't know, try it. And so she was like touching her shoes and then touching her mouth and then touching her shoes again. She's like, oh, your shoes are so dirty. And she just stopped immediately. And like, she kind of like thought about it and then didn't touch her shoes again. And mom was like, oh my gosh, I didn't ever think I could do that. And I'm like, yeah, it makes our lives a lot easier. So that way, then kids start thinking about, oh, that's dirty. Actually, maybe I shouldn't do that. And less of like, I'm waiting for somebody to tell me no, or else I'm going to just do this because I feel like it.
I would argue that that's another step towards making really strong relationships between the adults and the child, which mm-hmm. makes them value adult attention more. I find that with my 3-year-old, and I've really had to apply this to all of my kids. My older kids kind of got the very old school Kennedy Krieger, Marcus trained, everything's going to be 3-stepped in this house, dad, to where now I've really had to understand that my kids deserve to know why, and they deserve at times for me, or not at times, they deserve to me to often listen. So I remember just a couple of days ago, my son and I were leaving the clinic, and it was overcast, looked like it was about to storm, and he goes, oh, look, Daddy, there's a bird. And so I look up and I'm looking around in the sky and I'm like, dude, there's no birds here. They're like, it's about to storm. And instead of just saying, like I may have done 15 years ago, no, Bubba, there's no bird here. I said, where do you see a bird? He walks all the way. Now we're 30 feet from my car. He walks all the way to my car and points to a bird on my license plate that I didn't even know was there because I hadn't attended to it enough. And I was like, well, yes, sure enough. So instead of this now being me telling him there's no birds here, kind of talking down to him like we tend to do sometimes as adults, I gave him that opportunity to say, okay, you show me. And I saw it and now made that a now positive interaction rather than something that could have very well sent him off and made it very aversive. And so I think that kind of gets back to, hey, we all deserve to know why. This isn't a robotic field. It shouldn't be a robotic field. We shouldn't just follow orders, and then I think that kind of holding up of why as an important value also frees your RBTs to come back and not only maybe ask questions to get you thinking, but also they're the ones on the ground. They have more exposure to the behaviors of our clients than we do. And we need them to tell us what they're seeing. And so I think not only can it build strong relationships between adults and clients, but it can build stronger relationships between BCBAs and RBTs because we're showing them we value you enough to not just expect you to blindly follow these protocols, but we're going to tell you why. And once they hear the why, they're like, okay, I can get behind that and I can be passionate about that, even if I'm not having a good day.
And I think it really helps with generalization too. I think a lot of the DTT targets we do can be ran NET also. And so if the RBT understands why they're running that target in a DTT setting and they all of a sudden see an opportunity to run it NET, they do here at Apollo. And that's what I really love is like, I'm constantly praising that behavior of like, you took this fun opportunity and still made it a learning opportunity, even though that wasn't the intention. And you gave them, contact with that, instruction again. And so, I really love that concept of like giving that creative freedom to whoever is, implementing it most often.
That's such a wonderful thing to hear. I've seen that in other settings, of other teams that I've led, where it's just like when you really empower your RBTs to not feel like they're just blindly following orders, but that they're part of this. They are like your little mini research team and your little clinical team. And it's really wonderful to see how creative they could be in ways that really benefit the client. And so I hope that if there are some BCBAs out there who kind of feel like maybe they're having the opposite experience, that they don't feel like these things. And I think that could be a lot of why we see so many in our field trying to take issue with ABA. It's like, hey, maybe it's not ABA. Maybe it's the specific environment in which you're trying to implement ABA. And if your environment is not conducive to this openness, this focus and value on relationships at all aspects of treatment, and then making sure everyone understands not just what we're doing, why we're doing it. It kind of gets down to, I love the way Kristen describes our clinical model to other people, is that we're out of the business of teaching children what to learn. We just want to teach them how to learn and then get them out of treatment as fast as possible. Yeah. And I think that's that makes it exciting. And when, you said something I've heard from a lot of BCBAs over the years I've been doing this, which is my biggest problem is keeping up with my client. Isn't that a great problem to have? Is it your client's progressing so fast that you are stressed just making sure that they have relevant material to go through? I wish we could have that problem with all of our kids.
Yeah.
And I wish that more in the field could see that, because maybe they would, that passion that brought them into the field in the first place would stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think that's a nice note to end on here. And I want to thank you guys for sharing the, I guess the inner workings, if you will, of Apollo. It sounds like you guys are fostering just kind of a really productive and collegial culture that is very much client focused and treatment focused. So Christina, also, thanks so much for chatting with Jim and me, and even delving into some of those, kind of personal details. And I can only, guess of how difficult it must be to, kind of come back from maternity leave and and things like that. So I really appreciate you taking the time to.
I personally appreciate that because I've had other BCBAs that have struggled with this. And I think it's kind of one of those issues that's not widely talked about in our field, and I think the same applies to dads as well. I leave my family every day, and during the week, it's been so one of the rewarding things about having my son with me now is that, hey, I get to spend more time with him. And it's hard to be a parent and a behavior analyst because you're away from your family quite a bit.
Yeah. And I actually just talked to the team about it, and I was like, as I was thinking about how to say things, gracefully, because it is tough. I kind of told them, people, when someone has a major life event, like say a death in the family, people rally around that person and they make sure they're okay. They might buy them, dinners, not that as a new mom or new dad, that's what you're asking for, but I think people don't understand that's still a major life change. And so you should still probably really check in on your colleagues, hey, are you okay? Do you, is there anything that you need help with? Do you feel behind? I think it's very simple things like that we don't think about in that context per se. And it's not just ABA, it's really anybody, even family. Yes, it's a very exciting time, but also mentally, there's so much to process. There's so much change. There's so much happening. Just checking in with those people in your life and, making sure they still feel supported.
Yeah, those are some, great advice. So again, this has been a really fun conversation, and it's been especially fun for me to just kind of sit on the sidelines and listen in. And I guess restrain myself from commenting for the most part, with one or two exceptions. So again, a treat for me. So thanks so much for joining me. And Jim, I'll see you in the Apollo Case Study Series number 7.
Number 7. Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.